The rope burns on Hannah Brooks's wrists had not stopped bleeding when the first wagon rolled past. She lay in the scorching dust beside the massive wooden gate of her ranch, her voice cracked and dry as she whispered a single word into the wind. Water. No one stopped. The driver of the timber wagon only pulled his wide-brimmed hat lower over his eyes, flicking the reins to make his team move faster. He didn't want to see her. In Red Mesa Valley, looking too long at someone in trouble was a good way to find yourself in the same dirt. A few yards away, on the wooden boardwalk, the town preacher hurried past. He clutched his black leather Bible tightly against his chest, keeping his eyes locked firmly on the floorboards of the general store. Right behind him, the local merchant rushed out, carrying a crate of salted pork. He paused for half a second, his gaze dropping to where Hannah lay in the dirt. But the heavy, rhythmic thud of a Granger ranch horse approaching down the lane made him snap his head back up. He slammed his shop door shut and dropped the iron latch with a loud, echoing clack. Fear was cheaper than kindness that morning. Everyone in town knew the unwritten law. Silas Granger owned the valley, and anyone who helped Hannah Brooks would answer to him. A local ranch hand leaned against the corral fence, chewing on a piece of straw. He wanted to reach for his canteen, but he looked up at the ridge where the watchtower stood. He spit his straw into the dust, muttered an apology to the empty air, and turned his back. Hannah tried to lift her head, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on her bruised shoulders. Her mind flashed back to just 24 hours earlier, inside the stifling heat of the ranch office. Silas Granger had slammed a thick stack of papers onto the splintered pine desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped room. He leaned forward, his heavy silver belt buckle catching the light from the oil lamp. "Sign," Silas commanded, his voice as cold and flat as a slate gravestone. Hannah kept her hands firmly flat on the table, her knuckles white. "Not until you tell me why my husband's name is on those papers." Silas only smiled, a slow, predatory tightening of his thin lips. "Because dead men don't argue." Anna had refused. She had pushed the papers away, demanding to know what happened to Daniel, demanding to know how a deed signed in blood and ink had suddenly appeared in the hands of a man who owned half the territory. Silas did not argue twice. He signaled his foreman, and within minutes the small family was dragged out into the blazing sun. Silas stood on the front porch of the ranch house, looking down at them like a king surveying dirt. "Anyone who helps her answers to Granger Ranch," Silas shouted to the terrified neighbors gathered at a distance. Little Emma had been crying, her small fingers clutching the frayed hem of Hannah's skirt so hard her knuckles turned pale. Hannah had knelt down, brushing the dust from her daughter's cheeks, and whispered a warning she prayed the girl would understand. "Don't go home." She couldn't tell her why. She couldn't tell her about the loose floorboards under the bed, or the metal box Daniel had hidden before he rode out into the hills and never came back. Out by the giant ranch gate, the dust hung suspended in the heavy air like a golden curtain. The mysterious rider finally reached the edge of the property line. His horse stepped lightly, its coat dark and damp with sweat from a long journey across the Badlands. The stranger wore a dusty canvas duster, a low-crowned hat shadowing his face, and a heavy Colt revolver tied low against his right thigh. He didn't look like a man looking for trouble, but he certainly didn't look like a man who ran from it either. His dark eyes drifted down to Hannah. They lingered for a long moment on her bleeding wrists, and then something caught his attention. A faded blue ribbon tied securely around her left wrist. A small, almost imperceptible shift crossed his weathered face. Without a word, he swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted. His spurs jingled softly against the dry earth. He unbuckled the tin canteen from his saddle horn, stepping past the rusted hinges of the gate, and knelt beside the fallen widow. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching this story from. Drop your location in the comment section. And if this story is worth your time, do well to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get back to the story. The stranger unscrewed the cap of the canteen and held it to Hannah's parched lips. She drank greedily, the cool water bringing a sudden, sharp rush of life back into her veins. The stranger didn't offer empty comforts or grand speeches. He just waited until she had enough, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Can you stand?" Lane Riker finally asked. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sounded like grinding stones. Hannah tried. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her legs shaking violently beneath her torn dress. Halfway up, her knees buckled under the exhaustion and the pain of the rope burns. Before she hit the dust, Lane's strong arms slid around her waist, catching her effortlessly. He pulled her up to her feet, supporting her weight without breaking a sweat. "We need to get inside," Hannah breathed, leaning against the fence post for balance. "Not yet," Lane said, his eyes scanning the empty horizon. They made their way toward the main ranch house, the front door hanging slightly off its hinges where Silas's men had kicked it in. Inside, the room was a disaster. Drawers had been pulled out and emptied onto the floor, chairs overturned, and family photographs smashed into the dirt. Silas's men had torn the place apart looking for something, but they had missed the obvious. Lane stepped into the corner of the small parlor where a child's bedroom had been partitioned off. There sat a small, hand-carved wooden rocking horse that Daniel had made for Emma's 4th birthday. The paint was chipping at the mane, and one of the rockers was slightly loose. Lane knelt beside it, running a calloused thumb over the wooden joint. He noticed a tiny discrepancy in the grain. With the blade of his pocket knife, he gently pried open a hidden compartment built into the belly of the toy. Inside lay a tightly rolled bundle of oilcloth. Lane pulled it out and unrolled it on the floorboards. Hannah gasped as she looked over his shoulder. There were forged land deeds bearing the forged signature of the territorial governor, stolen property titles belonging to half the families in Red Mesa, and Daniel's own handwritten ledger detailing every illegal land grab Silas Granger had orchestrated over the last 5 years. The smallest toy in the valley was carrying the biggest secret. Daniel had known what Silas was planning, Lane murmured, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. He was gathering proof to shut him down for good. Before they could secure the papers, the sound of thundering hooves vibrated through the floorboards. Dust kicked up outside the front window as half a dozen armed riders surrounded the house. Silas Granger himself sat atop a massive bay stallion, a Remington shotgun resting casually across his saddlebow. He rode right up to the porch, his face twisted into an ugly, confident grin. "You're standing in the wrong man's way," Granger shouted, kicking his horse forward until the animal's chest pressed against the porch railing. Lane stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting casually inches from the butt of his Colt. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, and didn't back down. "Then you're standing in mine," Lane replied quietly. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "You think one drifting gunfighter can take on the whole valley, mister? You don't know who owns this town." "I know who's about to lose it," Lane said. Before Silas could raise his shotgun, Lane moved with terrifying speed. He didn't draw to kill. Instead, his hand flashed out, grabbing the barrel of Silas's weapon and shoving it skyward, just as the trigger pulled. The loud blast tore a hole in the wooden porch roof. With a sharp twist of his wrist, Lane yanked the heavy shotgun out of Silas's grip, tossed it aside, and leaped off the porch, landing squarely in the saddle of a nearby Granger henchman, knocking the man sprawling into the dirt. The fight was over, almost as quickly as it started. The hired guns looked at each other, realizing their boss was disarmed and staring down the barrel of a professional. None of them were willing to die for Silas Granger's land grab. "Get up," Lane told Silas, dragging the heavy ranch owner down from his horse. The next morning, the sun broke bright and clear over Red Mesa Valley. The dirt street was packed with townspeople who had stayed behind their locked doors just days before. Lane Riker rode slowly down the center of the road, leading a horse with Silas Granger tied securely to the saddle. But it wasn't the captive rancher that made people stop and stare. It was what Lane held in his hands. He rode straight up to the heavy oak doors of the town courthouse. With slow, deliberate hammer strikes, Lane nailed the forged land deeds, the stolen titles, and Daniel's ledger directly into the wood for everyone to see. The crowd fell dead silent. Shopkeepers stepped out onto their porches. The preacher dropped his gaze in shame. The merchant stared in disbelief at his own property title, pinned to the courthouse door, realizing Silas had stolen it fair and square on paper, but through pure fraud. Sheriff Owen Pike pushed his way through the front of the crowd, his face pale and sweating, despite the morning chill. He looked at the documents, then at Silas, and finally at Lane. For the first time in 10 years, the badge on the sheriff's chest actually meant something. Owen reached down, unholstered his spare cuffs, and clicked them firmly onto Silas Granger's wrists. "It's over, Silas," the sheriff said, his voice finally carrying a backbone of steel. "You're done." The loudest sound in town wasn't a gun, it was silence. A collective exhale from a valley that had held its breath for far too long. By afternoon, the ranch house was quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet. The stolen deeds were returned to their rightful owners, and the Granger empire began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. Hannah stood on the front porch, the blue ribbon fluttering gently in the breeze, holding Emma close as they watched the sun dip behind the distant purple mountains. Lane stood by his horse at the edge of the yard, checking his cinch strap one last time. He was ready to ride, the open desert calling him back into the endless horizon. Little Emma broke away from her mother for a second, running over to the tall stranger's boots. She looked up with wide, innocent eyes. "Why did you stop?" she asked softly. Lane looked down at the little girl, a rare, gentle softness touching the corners of his weathered eyes. He crouched down so he was eye level with her. "Because walking past is easy," Lane smiled. He stood up, swung into the saddle, and turned his horse toward the south. Without another word, he rode out of Red Mesa Valley, his figure slowly shrinking into the shimmering heat haze of the desert. Long after the hoofbeats disappeared into the desert, Red Mesa remembered the day one silent man stopped. But they never forgot the widow who refused to surrender.